This is the Western Rail Corridor. Newly reopened in March 2010, the line from Ennis, County Clare to Athenry, County Galway linked the cities of Limerick and Galway by rail for the first time in decades. From the moment the project was proposed, critics argued that it would never attract enough passengers. But for advocates, this was to be a vital public transport spine for the west of Ireland. With the opening of the line, the gulf between the two sides has become a chasm.
For the amount of money that's been spent on this and the small number of people that are using it, you could give each of them a free taxi. You could make them a present of a free taxi and it would be cheaper.
Colin McCarthy has spoken in vituperative terms about not only this project but about the people of the west of Ireland. We are not interested in toy railways, as he said to Marion Finucane. We are interested in infrastructure for the communities and the region that we live in and for the children of this region into the future.
We set off on a journey along the Western Rail Corridor last Thursday to get an impression of how many people were actually using the service. The train that left Athenry heading for Ennis shortly after 10 a.m. was virtually empty, with only 4 passengers aboard. It generally stops at intermediate stations without the doors ever opening. Only at Ennis did more passengers board, bound for Limerick. The 12:34 service from Ennis heading to Galway wasn't much more full, but the fact that there are so few people aboard makes it a very pleasant way to travel for those who do use it, many of them pensioners availing of their free travel passes.
If you're not a good traveller, a train is excellent. If you're elderly, you can get up and walk about. It's also got toilet facilities, which can be very important. And if, like us today, you want to have a picnic, you can do it.
Well, I always loved the train because I remember when the train was running years ago, when in my young days we always went to Limerick in the train and Ennis in the train. And, you know, so I suppose I have a thing for the train and I was thrilled when it opened.
This is the train that left Crockwell at 15:37 this afternoon, and the story is much the same as it has been all day. There's a total of 5 people on this train, one of whom is on a free travel pass. The 17:30 train from Galway decanted most of its passengers at Athenry, but there were still 38 people left on the train to travel the new line towards Limerick. Approximately half of these seemed to be pensioners, including those returning from their day trips.
It was music and a carnival atmosphere all along the Limerick-Galway rail route today, in service again for the first time since 1976.
At the opening of the line in March 2010, politicians of every hue were keen to squeeze political credit out of the new service. But even then there seemed a certain nervousness on the part of the minister as to whether people would actually use it.
The usage of this, the support for this, will be a huge indicator of how badly the west of Ireland needs it, and I'm just saying to people, use it, and that will ensure the phases 2 and 3 will be completed.
The 2006 business case for the Western Rail Corridor by Iarnród Éireann predicted 320 additional trips between Galway and Limerick, translating into 100,000 trips per annum on the new line, which was projected to double to 200,000 in 5 years. The reality is very different. Last year, the total number of fare-paying passengers using any part of the new line amounted to 34,461. With approximately 4,200 services a year, that means that each train carries an average of 8 paying customers.
The situation is that the railway from Limerick to Galway has been opened. It's in its infancy in terms of its development. The purchase of season tickets, monthly tickets, annual tickets is growing. And over time, I absolutely believe that more and more people will come to use these services.
The numbers of people using the section between Ennis and Athenry appear to be about 8 people per train. In other words, 2 taxi loads. So it has been a colossal waste of taxpayers' money.
The Western Rail Corridor is not the actual piece of physical railway line that has been laid between Ennis and Athenry. The Western Rail Corridor, as defined by the government, as defined by Iarnród Éireann and by West on Track when we sought to open it in the first instance, the first phase of it was to link the cities of Galway and Limerick.
Supporters of the Western Rail Corridor object to critics' concentration on the amount of passengers using the new section of railway between Ennis and Athenry. They say that the service has to be judged on the far larger number using any part of the line from Limerick to Galway. The problem is that the lines from Galway to Athenry and Limerick to Ennis, effectively suburban services, always existed, and Iarnród Éireann was always free to increase services on those lines without ever building the Western Rail Corridor. Advocates argue that the investment will drive increasing passenger numbers, effectively an argument that we have built it and they will come.
If you want to create a counterbalance in terms of economic development to Dublin, you have to put in a certain amount of infrastructure first, and the fundamental part of that infrastructure will be the Western Rail Corridor, allowing rail public transport. And when you have the infrastructure in place, then the economic development will follow as sure as day follows night.
To choose to spend money on the building of infrastructure, it seems to me, is a wise thing to do. It seems to me further that at a time of a recession we should try to maximise our commitment to providing infrastructure.
There's a strange idea in Ireland that investment is just good, and that investing taxpayers' money in infrastructure is just good, and that there is always a shortage of infrastructure and now is always the right time to spend more money on it. But that just doesn't make any economic sense. Each project has to be evaluated on its merits.
To an economist, this is not merely a railway, it is a high-capacity transport system. Its purpose is to move large numbers of people quickly. And many of them would say that the only possible justification for building and operating such an expensive system is the existence of dense centres of population, not merely at either end of the line, but living right along it, which is not exactly the situation that applies on the Western Rail Corridor.
There are questions to be asked about whether every train should stop in small villages. I'm not altogether a fan of that myself. But what I absolutely would refute is any suggestion that by building a railway from between the third and fourth largest cities of the state, you're doing something that ultimately could not be seen to make sense.
The only pairs of cities around Western Europe that consistently produce enough volume of passengers to justify passenger rail service are cities with 1 million people in each of them. So we don't have pairs of cities like that in Ireland.
While the line cost over €100 million to build, Primetime understands that low passenger numbers mean that it will now require an operating subsidy of approximately €3 million a year just to cover its day-to-day running costs, a subsidy of €85 per paying passenger.
It is unconscionable for the government to preside over a rail service between Galway and Limerick, which is slower than the bus alternative, which is less frequent than the bus alternative, and which is costing €85 per trip in taxpayer subsidy.
So with usage figures like this, is there any realistic prospect of the planned further extension of the line north to Claremorris, even if our long-awaited economic recovery eventually arrives?
There may be a delay. I mean, we live in difficult economic times, but the fundamentals are still there. We're determined to bring this to the hub town of Tuam, which is North Galway, hasn't been served by trains for rail service for forever. And you know, when we do all this, we'll still be back to a stage where we were 30 years after the famine in terms of public transport in the west of Ireland.
There's a strange argument for investment in the regions here, which I've never quite understood. But it goes something like this. If money gets wasted in one part of the country, then there ought to be money wasted in all the other parts of the country out of a sense of fairness. It doesn't make sense to build railway lines to provide train services that attract 8 passengers per train. That doesn't make sense in the west, the east, the north or the south. And it's got nothing to do with regional development. It's got to do with racking up the national debt to ever higher levels to no useful purpose.
In these dark economic times, the government can plead inability to pay on almost any project. But the question of extending the Western Rail Corridor is now much more fundamental. It is whether it could ever be justified, even when the bright new dawn finally arrives.